The night on Alecto was not silent. Nothing in the Imperium ever truly was. Even in darkness, loudspeakers still whispered hymns to the Emperor, as if reminding every breathing soul that freedom was not a right, but a mercy granted by a distant, golden corpse. People slept in their habitation blocks, stacked like gravestones, afraid to dream of anything beyond their assigned labor quotas. For most citizens, hope had become a myth, a forbidden indulgence, like touching relic glass with bare hands. But beneath the smog-choked skies, something lived, a thought, a whisper, a treasonous idea. What if life existed beyond this iron regime? Tonight would be the night one dared to ask that question out loud, though they would pay in terror for even thinking it. On a rusted balcony overlooking the loading docks, an older man named Hale stood motionless, as though listening for the sound of betrayal in the air. He was once a cargo technician, now reduced to hauling scrap for the Adeptus Mechanicus. His eyes carried the weight of someone who once believed in the Imperium, until he saw the price of loyalty. He had watched citizens disappear, taken for questioning and never seen again, swallowed by the Inquisition's silent machinery. Hale understood the rule. It wasn't that you couldn't leave the Imperium. It was that attempting to do so meant being erased, mind, body, and soul. Yet tonight, in his silent defiance, he dared to imagine something unholy: escape. Just the word itself was poison, but he whispered it anyway. Across the colony, in the dim-lit dorm sector, a young woman named Saren lay awake in her bunk, clutching a forbidden data slate hidden beneath her uniform. It held a map of warp routes, a relic stolen from a drunk naval officer who died 2 weeks later in what authorities called a random accident. Saren had grown up under the Imperium's banners, taught that the Emperor's light was salvation. But she had also witnessed starvation rations due to families what bolters could not, slowly hollowing them into ghosts. She had seen what it did to her little brother. The Imperium promised protection, but delivered suffering. The idea of leaving was terrifying, but the idea of staying felt worse. She pressed the data slate to her forehead like a prayer and breathed one trembling vow: "I'm not dying here." Meanwhile, in the dark enforcement towers, the Arbites monitored the colony with cold vigilance. Their skull-faced helmets reflected the pulse of security screens. Your every citizen was reduced to a tracking ID. Beneath them, servitors whispered binary curses plugged directly into the surveillance grid. Nothing escaped scrutiny. Not movement, not pattern, not deviation. And yet, something was brewing. Something small enough to evade algorithms, but large enough to trigger fate. A cluster of individuals, strangers until today, would soon converge in secret. Hale, Saren, and others like them, broken, desperate, quietly furious. They were not rebels. They were not heretics. They were simply human. And somewhere deep beneath the machinery of repression, humanity still stirred. But in the Imperium, humanity was the deadliest secret of all. And so the stage was set, not for a heroic escape, not for a triumphant rebellion, but for a terrified gamble against an empire that owned every heartbeat of its citizens. The question was never whether someone would pay the price for leaving, only how much blood it would cost. The dawn over Alecto did not break with sunlight, it broke with sirens. At 4 o'clock, The morning broadcast wailed from brass vox horns mounted on every building, a droning chant praising the emperor and condemning sloth. The citizens stirred like ghosts rising from graves, forced from their concrete bunks to begin the march to their assigned labor sectors. The streets were gray, the sky was gray, even the faces were gray. There were no songs of mourning, no conversations, no laughter, only the shuffle of boots and the hum of industry. Posters of imperial propaganda glared down like watchful eyes, smiling workers carrying endless loads, families saluting the throne, children kneeling in devotion. But the real people looked nothing like the posters. Their cheeks were thin, their eyes ringed with fatigue, and their spines curved from years of bending. Freedom was not a memory, just something rumored in the old stories, the ones nobody dared to retell aloud. The ration lines were a daily ritual of humiliation. Hale waited with others, beneath the flickering lumen strips, while servitors ladled out paste that tasted like rust and sadness. The rations were always insufficient, just enough to keep a human conscious, never enough to grant strength. Hale remembered the taste of real bread from his youth, but those memories felt like fiction now, cruel in their warmth. Children were given slightly more food to prevent collapse, while adults carried the burden of starvation in silence. Guards patrolled the lines with shock mauls, not to maintain order, but to enforce despair. The message was clear: this is your life, and you will accept it. Conversations were whispers, traded behind cupped hands. If someone spoke too boldly, made a joke or complaint, they were marked. The next day, they simply weren't there. Their bunk would be empty, their ID tag removed, their name erased from the labor lists. Religion in the Imperium did not offer comfort. It offered compliance. Every night, mandatory faith broadcasts filled the dorms. Prayers to the emperor, denunciations of aliens, warnings of chaos corruption. Children recited catechisms until they fell asleep. Adults mouthed the words too, but without belief, only obedience. In one corner of the dorm, an old priest named Calvis delivered sanctioned sermons with the tone of a hollow man. Hale listened sometimes, not for faith, but for irony. The priest spoke of sacrifice and divine burden, but Calvis himself was shaking, barely able to stand, his skin cracked from malnutrition. The emperor demanded devotion, but never returned it. In this world, prayer was not a plea, it was a performance, and if you did not perform, you were suspect. Siren's job in the mechanical yards offered a different window into the Imperium's soul. She worked beside servitors, once men and women, now mind-wiped husks, fueled by implanted machinery. Their eyes were glassy, mouths slack, limbs stiffened by metal grafts. They had lost everything: names, identities, memories, reduced to tools. Whenever Siren looked at them, she felt a shiver of fear because she knew this was the lowest price for disobedience. At least the executed were gone swiftly, but servitors lived on, souls stolen, bodies enslaved, forced into eternal workload with no sense of self. Sometimes she imagined that behind their empty eyes, some flicker of humanity remained. But if it did, it was trapped forever, screaming inside a prison of bone and steel. She would rather die than become one of them. People here did not dream of greatness. They dreamed of ending the day alive. The fear of betrayal poisoned every interaction. A friendly face might hide an informer. A coworker might whisper your name to a commissar for an extra ration token. Families were not safe with each other. Even siblings measured their words. This was not paranoia. It was survival. The Imperium did not rule through loyalty. It ruled through terror. And strange as it sounds, that terror worked, because no matter how horrible life was, people stayed in line. They got up, they worked, they obeyed. Not because they loved the Emperor, but because they feared those who served him. And yet, beneath that suffocating atmosphere, an ember of defiance remained. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, almost invisible. A glance shared between workers when a speaker broadcast yet another lie. A smirk when a commissar recited propaganda with robotic devotion. A muttered curse under breath. It was not enough to spark rebellion, but enough to remind them that they were still thinking beings. And that ember is where the story truly began. Because survival is one thing, but the refusal to die as a slave is another. In the deepest corners of Alecto, in whispered conversations and hidden hoax, there lived a question older than any empire. What if we could leave? And although most were too afraid to give it voice, some were not. Some were ready to risk everything. And when that courage finally collided with desperation, the Imperium would respond with horrors none of them were prepared to face. Onhail crouched in the shadow of a maintenance shaft, his breath shallow and steady, trying to make himself part of the darkness. The colony slept, but not all of it. Eyes watched from towers and windows, sensors scanned every corner, and servitors patrolled with the silent certainty of death. He unfolded a worn datapad, its screen dim, but enough to reveal the stolen warp route maps. Each line was a promise, each junction a potential trap. He traced a finger over the twisted, labyrinthine corridors that led off Alecto, imagining a path beyond the Imperium's iron grip. The knowledge was intoxicating and terrifying. One misstep, one misread signal, and the entire colony would know of his betrayal before he even reached the outer perimeter. And yet, he could not stop. Escape was the only word keeping him alive in a place designed to erase hope. Saren arrived silently at the rendezvous point, a forgotten maintenance alcove behind the generator towers. She carried her data slate as though it were a child, careful not to drop it or make a sound. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, louder than the faint hum of the machinery. She had studied the maps over countless nights, memorizing patrol shifts, sensor sweeps, and hidden corridors. Every detail mattered. A single lapse could mean capture or death. As Hale emerged from the shadows, she offered him a nod, the only communication they dared risk. Around them, the colony's dorms were silent. Yet somewhere, hidden in the darkness, someone could be listening. Every shadow was a potential enemy. Every sound, a potential betrayal. And still, they whispered their plan to one another, carefully, like thieves plotting in a cathedral of doom. The group they had gathered was small, but each member carried a weight as heavy as their chains. There was Lorik, once a naval cadet, his eyes hollow from starvation and fear, but his hands steady and capable. Mara, a former scribe whose knowledge of records made her invaluable for bypassing checkpoints, and two others who had learned silence as survival, their faces pale and marked by nights of hunger. Each one had lost something to the Imperium, family, faith, or self. And yet, here they were, risking all for a sliver of freedom. Plans were drawn and redrawn on scraps of scrap metal, coated with symbols known only to them. Every passage, every patrol rotation, every sensor blind spot was considered. But even as they strategized, a gnawing awareness lingered. No plan survived contact with the Imperium unscathed. At night, when the colony's loudspeakers silenced and the hum of machinery was all that remained, they met again to rehearse. Hale traced the path through the generator shafts, pointing out hidden vents and maintenance lifts. Saren demonstrated the subtle motions needed to avoid servitor detection, fingers moving like dancers over invisible controls. Lorik practiced hand signals, Mara memorized registry codes, and the others repeated routines until muscles remembered what minds feared. Every detail mattered. Every movement carried consequences heavier than death. And yet, as precise as they became, an unspoken dread lingered in the air. The Imperium did not forgive errors. It did not hesitate. It did not relent. One slip, one careless gesture, and the full machinery of an empire would crush them. But determination burned brighter than fear. Even in the shadows, hope was a stubborn fire. The danger was not only external. The Imperium had eyes everywhere, including inside the very people they trusted. Rumors of informants circulated among workers like poison. Someone could be reporting their plans for a token of favor, a ration increase, or simply survival. Each step forward was accompanied by a silent calculation. Who can I trust? Even among themselves, they measured words, masked excitement with routine conversation, hid maps beneath false panels, and erased digital traces. Every glance over a shoulder was an exercise in paranoia, every interaction a potential trap. And yet they pressed forward. Planning became an act of rebellion, and rebellion was a sin punishable by unimaginable torment. Each member knew that when the time came, they might not all survive, not because of the Imperium's forces alone, but because fear could fracture even the strongest alliances. Saren alone sometimes lingered after the meetings, staring at the maps long after the others had gone. She traced the warp routes with trembling fingers, imagining the cold void between star systems, the dead silence punctuated only by distant anomalies, and the possibility of a life unshackled by ration lines and propaganda. In these moments, she wondered if freedom was real or simply another illusion, cruelly dangled before those foolish enough to reach for it. She felt the weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest. If they were caught, every detail she had memorized could mark the end of every life in the group. And yet, she also felt something else, a pulse of defiance, stubborn and raw, that refused to be silenced. It was enough to keep her moving forward, to whisper to herself in the dark, "I will not be owned. I will not be broken. I will leave." And finally, the night before the attempt, the group gathered for one last discussion in the heart of the abandoned generator sector. The air was thick with anticipation, fear, and the faint tang of rust. They reviewed every detail, the timing of patrols, the weaknesses of sensors, the precise order of movement, even the contingencies if one of them was caught. Each member's face reflected not bravado, but the weight of survival, the acknowledgement that their choices carried consequences beyond themselves. For a moment, silence enveloped them, each one listening to their own heartbeat, each one imagining the horrors that might await outside the safety of the colony's walls. Yet, amid the dread, there was unity. Small, fragile, but real. They would attempt the impossible together. Tomorrow, the first step toward freedom would either be their salvation or the prelude to horrors the Imperium reserved for those who dared to dream beyond its chains. The night air was thick with tension as Hale and the others moved toward the outer perimeter of the colony. Every step was deliberate, calculated to avoid the faint red glow of sensor lenses and the whir of patrolling servitors. Shadows became allies, walls became shields, and every sound echoed like a warning. The streets, once empty at this hour, now felt alive with menace. The hum of distant generators and the occasional clang of machinery reminding them that the Imperium never slept. Hale's heart pounded in rhythm with the distant sirens of the colony's automated defenses. One misstep would alert the Arbites, and in that instant, the dream of freedom would turn into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The night air was thick with tension as Hale and the others moved toward the outer perimeter of the colony. Every step was deliberate, calculated to avoid the faint red glow of sensor lenses and the whir of patrolling servitors. Shadows became allies, walls became shields, and every sound echoed like a warning. The streets, once empty at this hour, now felt alive with menace. The hum of distant generators and the occasional clang of machinery reminding them that the Imperium never slept. Hale's heart pounded in rhythm with the distant sirens of the colony's automated defenses. One misstep would alert the Arbites, and in that instant, the dream of freedom would turn into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Their first obstacle came in the form of a locked service hatch, bolted and wired to the colony's main security grid. Mara knelt, fingers dancing across the interface, bypassing circuits and overriding locks with the precision of a seasoned scribe. Sparks flew, and a low hum vibrated through the hatch as the mechanisms grudgingly yielded. For a brief moment, the group allowed themselves to breathe, hearts slowing, confidence swelling. But Hale knew the impermanence of victory. Every act of success drew attention, every unlocked barrier a beacon in the vast machinery of the Imperium. He glanced at the others, faces pale but determined, and realized that their courage was the only shield they had. The Imperium did not forgive hesitation, but tonight, their unity might be enough to survive the first stage of the journey. They emerged into the upper service docks, a labyrinth of crates, scaffolding, and distant cranes. The open space left them exposed, but the glow of the colony's ambient lighting was dim, and shadows offered fleeting sanctuary. Hale signaled the group to crouch, holding his breath as servitors passed in a rhythmic patrol. The mechanical beasts were relentless, programmed for precision, their optics scanning with cold accuracy. One wrong movement would trigger alarms that could not be silenced. Each second was torture, each step a gamble with death. Yet the group moved with synchronized caution, muscles remembering rehearsed movements, hearts synchronized in a terrifying rhythm. Freedom was close enough to feel, but so was annihilation. A sudden clang shattered the fragile calm. One of the crates shifted beneath Saren's foot, sending a hollow echo through the dock. Instantly, servitor optics snapped toward them, red lenses glowing like eyes of the Emperor himself. Hale's mind raced, calculating escape routes. But the patrol moved too quickly, blocking multiple paths at once. Panic surged, but they'd trained for this. Lorik lunged, twisting a servitor's control mechanism, forcing it to misfire a warning blast harmlessly into the ceiling. The others darted, crawling beneath scaffolding, leaping over crates, hearts hammering. The moment was pure chaos, a ballet of terror and precision. And somewhere, distant but inevitable, the colony's alarms began to wail, cascading through the streets and dorms, signaling that the Imperium had detected the breach. Despite the rising alarm, they pressed on, guided by sheer determination and the memorized paths Mara had painstakingly encoded. Hale led the group to a secondary service lift, its interior dark and narrow. They slipped inside just as the distant sound of Arbite boots grew nearer, the metallic clatter of enforcement echoing through the docks. The lift shuddered as it descended, carrying them deeper into the industrial bowels of the colony. The air was thicker here, hot and fetid, smelling of oil and decay. Every moment was an agonizing test of nerves. The walls seemed to close in, the hum of machinery a constant reminder that they were trapped in a predator's lair. And yet, the darkness felt like detection, a fragile veil separating them from the Imperium's all-seeing gaze. They reached a narrow service tunnel leading to the colony's perimeter wall, the final barrier between captivity and the void beyond. Hale examined the exit point through the small viewport. Outside stretched the wasteland of Alecto's surface, barren and unwelcoming, but infinitely better than the suffocating machinery behind them. The wall itself was riddled with sensors, turrets, and motion trackers, every inch a gauntlet designed to kill. Mara and Saren worked in tandem, overriding circuits and masking their signatures, while the others kept watch. Every second felt like an eternity. One slip, one miscalculation, and the Imperium's response would be immediate and brutal. Sweat coated their faces, muscles burned, and hearts raced. But the taste of freedom was almost palpable, a bittersweet promise they could not ignore. Finally, Hale signaled forward, and one by one they began the climb. The wall scraped against their palms, cold metal biting into skin, but adrenaline pushed them upward. Below, the colony's lights cast long shadows, sensors sweeping back and forth in a deadly dance. Halfway over, Saren froze, her foot caught in a jagged seam, and a shriek tore from her throat. Hale lunged, yanking her free, as a volley of warning shots cracked the air above the wall. Sparks flew, metal screamed, and alarms shrieked in a crescendo of chaos. They scrambled, almost falling into the barren expanse below. Heartbeats collided with terror and exhilaration. And yet, even as they landed beyond the wall, alive but shaken, a deeper horror awaited them, because escaping the colony was only the first act, and the Imperium never forgets a debt. The alarms had barely faded when the first signs of the Imperium's wrath arrived. From the colony's central towers, Vox sirens blared across the wastelands, broadcasting a relentless decree. Traitors detected. Inquisition en route. Hale, Saren, and the others froze beneath a jagged outcropping of metal and stone, hearts hammering in unison as distant shadows moved with precision. Arbite's patrols surged like predators, their skull-faced helmets glinting in the faint starlight. Servitors whirred, their limbs slicing the air with mechanical certainty. The Imperium's response was not hesitant, not measured. It was absolute. Every shadow, every corridor, every sensor was alive with intent. Escape was no longer a possibility. It was a sentence, and the sentence had begun. Within hours, the hunt intensified. Dropships thundered overhead, casting harsh spotlights that cut across the barren surface of Alecto. Below, Enforcement teams converged with terrifying coordination, scanning, probing, and isolating every potential hiding place. The fugitives moved in silence, their previous confidence now replaced by raw terror. Hale's mind raced as he calculated the chances of evasion. Slim, almost non-existent. Saren clutched the Dana slate to her chest, her knuckles white with fear. The cold reality settled like iron in their chests. The Imperium did not merely recapture runaways. It punished them in ways designed to break the flesh, the mind, and the soul. And for the few who survived, life as they knew it would be obliterated. Captured escapees were dealt with swiftly. Those unlucky enough to be intercepted were dragged into mobile interrogation chambers, where the Inquisition's presence was more terrifying than any weapon. Within these metal cages, the air itself seemed to hum with psychic menace. Psychers hovered above the prisoners, probing memories, dragging secrets from the mind with invisible claws. Those who resisted screamed until their voices fractured into silence. The interrogators asked no questions. They demanded obedience, compliance, and revelation. Failure was met with immediate and brutal correction. Neural lashings, psychic lacerations, or permanent mind wipes. Hale had heard rumors, whispered in the shadows, of souls erased entirely, leaving bodies alive but empty, a walking testament to the Imperium's merciless justice. The psychological torment was as cruel as the physical. Prisoners were often placed in isolation, fed barely enough to survive, and subjected to relentless indoctrination. Voices boomed from unseen loudspeakers, repeating the Emperor's decrees, denouncing traitors, and erasing hope. Some prisoners went mad, talking to themselves, pleading with unseen gods, or sobbing for long-lost families. Others learned silence, internalizing terror as a survival mechanism. The Imperium understood fear better than any weapon could, and wielded it with surgical precision. Within the confines of the interrogation chambers, a single thought of rebellion became a dangerous luxury, one that could lead to death, mutilation, or a transformation into something unrecognizable, something no longer human. Outside, the Imperium's reach extended further than the immediate capture zones. Patrols scoured neighboring sectors, scouting drones reported every anomaly, and loyal citizens were encouraged or coerced to report any suspicious behavior. The fugitives' allies, if they had any, were not spared. Informants were rewarded with privileges or survival. Friends who hesitated were vanished. The Imperium's network was a living web of control, capable of reaching anyone, anywhere, at any time. Hale realized that even if they avoided the immediate grasp of Arbites and servitors, the Imperium's influence would shadow them indefinitely. There was no sanctuary, no respite. Every corner of Alecto was a potential trap. Every flicker of light, a surveillance lens. Every shadow, a harbinger of doom. The Empire did not forgive, and it did not forget. As the night dragged on, the fugitives observed from hidden vantage points, witnessing the machinery of retribution unfold. Servitors dragged captured comrades into the interrogation chambers, chains scraping the ground in a metallic dirge. Psychers hovered over trembling figures, probing thoughts, exposing memories, leaving scars on the mind that were invisible, yet permanent. The screams and moans that echoed through the colony were not merely noises, They were lessons, each one crafted to ensure that any observer understood the consequences of defiance. Hale's stomach churned, Saren trembled, and even the most composed of their group began to doubt the wisdom of escape. The Imperium was patient. The Imperium was thorough, and it would not relent until the debt for their audacity was paid in full. Communication with the outside world offered no solace. Signals were intercepted, false broadcasts disseminated, and every attempt to relay information beyond the colony was met with immediate tracing and retaliation. Messages were twisted, hopes were crushed, and allies disappeared in silence. The fugitives realized that the Imperium's punishment was holistic. It consumed not just bodies, but trust, connection, and any possibility of a safe harbor. Every act of resistance became a mark against them. Every moment spent hiding was a ticking clock counting down to capture. And yet, there was no visible face of the Empire, only the mechanical, psychic, and bureaucratic machinery moving with terrifying inevitability. The Imperium was not a single entity. It was a system, and the system never faltered. By dawn, the survivors were forced to confront the true scale of the Imperium's response. Paths they had once thought safe were now crawling with hunters, drones, and servitors. Strategic exits had been blocked, and patrols adapted to their patterns with terrifying speed. Even in hiding, Hale and Saren felt the psychological weight pressing down, each heartbeat a reminder that freedom had a cost. Some of the captured had been executed outright. Others had been sent for re-education, a euphemism for horrors too dark to describe. The Imperium's response was a tapestry of terror, each thread carefully woven to ensure obedience and instill dread. And yet, despite witnessing the fate of those taken, the fugitives pressed on, driven by a stubborn ember of hope that defied reason and reality. The Imperium's reach was relentless, its wrath precise, and its cruelty unfathomable. Every corridor, every vent, every shadow became a potential instrument of punishment. The fugitives learned, with bitter clarity, that the Imperium did not simply enforce law. It consumed the will of those who dared to defy it. Fear became a constant companion, their senses attuned to every whisper, every movement, every vibration in the air. The knowledge that one wrong step could erase identity, destroy minds, or twist bodies into something unrecognizable haunted them like a living predator. Yet even in the face of this unyielding terror, Hale and Saren pressed forward, knowing that stopping meant submission, and submission in the Imperium was a slow, excruciating death. Their only path was onward, into the shadows, away from everything they had ever known. Carrying the haunting understanding, the Imperium's reach was relentless, its wrath precise, and its cruelty unfathomable. Every corridor, every vent, every shadow became a potential instrument of punishment. The fugitives learned, with bitter clarity, that the Imperium did not simply enforce law. It consumed the will of those who dared to defy it. Fear became a constant companion, their senses attuned to every whisper, every movement, every vibration in the air. The knowledge that one wrong step could erase identity, destroy minds, or twist bodies into something unrecognizable haunted them like a living predator. Yet even in the face of this unyielding terror, Hale and Saren pressed forward, knowing that stopping meant submission, and submission in the Imperium was a slow, excruciating death. Their only path was onward, into the shadows, away from everything they had ever known, carrying the haunting understanding that the Empire had already claimed much more than their freedom. It had claimed pieces of their souls. Inside the Imperium's re-education chambers, the horrors escalated beyond comprehension. Psychers hovered over prisoners, their minds probing memories and dragging secrets to the surface like fish from deep waters. Resistance was futile. Those who attempted to fight back against the psychic intrusion were broken quickly, nerve and muscle alike refusing to obey the will of the individual. In the background, servitors methodically applied physical punishment, electrical lashes, clamps, and restraint devices designed to inflict maximum pain with minimal effort. Some prisoners went catatonic, staring into nothingness, their identities erased inch by inch. Others screamed, only to have their voices muted by neural suppressors. The Imperium did not seek revenge for cruelty alone. It sought to obliterate the self, leaving only obedience, fear, and hollow compliance. Survivors who were sent to the Mechanicus for experimental integration faced a fate that defied both horror and reason. Flesh was replaced with cold steel, organs augmented or removed, eyes swapped for lenses that pierced both darkness and soul. Some emerged unrecognizable, shuffling among the living as shadows of what they had been. Hale shivered at the thought. The Imperium's punishment was not merely physical, it was existential. Every modification, every neural implant, every bone fused with machinery was a statement. The Imperium would own not just your body, but the essence of who you were. Even survival was no comfort, because to live under such control was to cease being truly human. And yet, those who remained alive, broken or transformed, were paraded as examples to others, living warnings etched in suffering. For those condemned to exile into the warp, there was no return. They were cast into the tempestuous currents of immaterium, their minds buffeted by incomprehensible forces, exposed to demonic whispers, and stripped of navigation or guidance. The few who emerged on distant fringe worlds were forever altered, haunted by the horrors of their passage. Sleep became impossible, reality fractured, and the constant gnawing sense of being hunted never faded. Hale had heard tales, half-whispered, of those who went mad within hours, screaming into empty voids, clawing at non-existent chains, or speaking in tongues only intelligible to the entities that haunted the warp. To escape the colony was not to escape punishment. It was merely to enter a different, equally insidious theater of suffering. Some of the fugitives' number were subjected to the Inquisition's most insidious techniques. Mind-wipe servitor conversion. Memories, names, attachments, and experiences were erased one by one. The body remained, but the person, the essence, the will, the very soul, was extracted and stored in the cold archives of the Imperium's control. Friends and allies became strangers. Identity dissolved into obedience. Hale could not imagine such a fate, and yet knew that the odds were heavy. Even those who thought they could hide, even those who believed they were clever enough to survive, eventually succumbed. The Imperium's patience was infinite, its reach absolute. In this grand machinery of punishment, mistakes were fatal, hesitation fatal, and hope itself a trap. Survival was measured not in years, but in moments of fleeting defiance. The psychological toll on those who survived even partial punishment was profound. Every captured member carried the echoes of screams, the visions of torn comrades, and the weight of irreversible decisions. Even outside the immediate grasp of the Imperium, paranoia festered. Trust dissolved. The survivors doubted one another, seeing potential betrayal in every glance. Nights were sleepless, haunted by nightmares of Arbeits patrols, servitor hunts, and psychic intrusions. A single whisper of a remembered scream could trigger convulsions, an uncontrollable tremor, or a breakdown. The Imperium's retribution extended far beyond its physical instruments, infiltrating the mind and soul until even the act of survival was a torment. Those who survived, in body or mind, carried the scars of an empire that demanded absolute compliance and punished audacity without mercy. Yet, even in the shadows of despair, a flicker of stubborn defiance persisted in some. Hale, Siren, and the few remaining members still held tightly to that ember of hope, even as they understood the severity of the Imperium's retaliation. Every choice became an agonizing calculation. Move or hide, speak or remain silent, trust or betray. They realized that survival was not merely about evading capture. It was about outthinking an omnipotent, omnipresent force. And as they navigated wastelands scarred by prior punishments, they understood the brutal truth. Escape was not freedom. It was a journey through horrors meticulously crafted to test body, mind, and soul. Each step forward, each breath taken beyond the Imperium's immediate grasp, was a gamble against a system that did not forget, did not forgive, and did not relent. In the desolate expanse beyond the colony, Hale looked at his companions and felt the crushing weight of inevitability. The Imperium's machinery had already claimed much more than their freedom. It had claimed innocence, peace, and certainty. Some had perished outright. Some had returned as hollow shells, their humanity twisted or erased entirely. Even the survivors bore deep psychological scars, memories of screams, psychic probes, and mechanical mutilation that would never fade. And yet, they pressed onward, driven by a force greater than fear, the stubborn ember of life that refused to be extinguished, a desperate will to reach whatever fragment of liberty the universe still allowed them. They had escaped the colony, but the Imperium's shadow was long, its vengeance patient, and its reach unyielding. Every step they took forward was a step further from the world they knew, and deeper into the nightmare of existence beyond Imperial control. Hale, Seren, and the remaining survivors had traversed the barren wastelands beyond Electo, but freedom remained an illusion. Every shadow could conceal a hunter, every whisper of wind a warning. Yet amid the despair, one figure moved differently. Lorik, whose resolve had carried him through the colony's labyrinth, had separated from the group under cover of night. He did not speak, did not falter, and did not hesitate. Each step took him further from the Imperium's immediate grasp, into territories that even the most audacious scouts rarely traversed. The distance he covered was measured not only in kilometers, but in the heartbeat of constant vigilance. Even as the distant sirens faded, he knew that nothing truly ended with physical escape. The Imperium's reach extended far beyond walls, turrets, and servitors. It reached into minds, memories, and fate itself. Crossing the wasteland was a study in survival. Lorik navigated the jagged terrain, moving under the ghostly glow of distant moons that barely illuminated his path. Nights were long, silent, and oppressive, and the wind carried whispers of the abandoned colony. as if mocking his attempt at freedom. He subsisted on meager rations scavenged from ruined outposts and forgotten caches. Each bite a reminder that life outside the Imperium was not safe. It was merely a cruel trial of endurance. Shadows lengthened with each passing hour, and every sound, a cracking stone, the distant cry of a nocturnal creature, forced him to freeze, pulse hammering in anticipation of death. Yet he pressed onward, guided by the memory of the horrors he had survived, knowing that hesitation could undo everything. Escape was never just physical. It demanded the soul's resolve, tempered in fear and sharpened in desperation. The further Lorik traveled, the more surreal the world became. Fringe planets were strange and unwelcoming, scarred by warp storms, alien flora, and the remnants of civilizations swallowed by time. Each landscape carried the weight of isolation, and each step brought him closer to the knowledge that the Imperium's vengeance was patient. He avoided trade posts, settlements, and known outposts, knowing that any contact could lead to exposure. Every interaction was calculated. Even the slightest slip could betray him to hidden agents or psychic probes sent to track him. Lorik's mind, once accustomed to camaraderie and coordination, now thrived on solitude and hyper-awareness. Sleep was shallow, fragmented, and haunted by visions of friends captured or transformed. Survival had become not just a matter of body, but a battle for sanity. Despite his isolation, Lorik's past haunted him relentlessly. Memories of the colony, of Saren's determined eyes, of Hale's whispered plans surfaced unbidden, mixing with nightmares of what the Imperium had done to captured comrades. He often replayed the screams, the psychic probes, the mechanical mutilations, and the mind-wiped servitors, each memory a scar etched into consciousness. Yet these visions were also fuel. They reminded him of what he had escaped, of what he refused to become, of the price the Imperium demanded from those who dared defy it. Every heartbeat was a testament to endurance, every cautious step a rebellion against the system that sought to claim him. Even far from the colony, the weight of guilt, loss, and trauma traveled with him, a silent companion in the void of freedom. Over weeks and months, Lorik adapted to the rhythms of survival. He learned to read the subtle signs of danger in alien skies, to navigate by stars twisted by warp interference, and to ration supplies with an efficiency born of necessity. The remnants of his humanity were preserved by ritual, moments of reflection under alien moons, whispered oaths to himself, and careful cataloging of each memory he refused to surrender. Despite the alien landscapes and the endless threat of pursuit, he began to feel the faintest pulse of something resembling hope. Yet it was fragile, always accompanied by the knowledge that the Imperium did not forget. The Empire's agents could strike decades later. Psychic echoes could locate him. The warp itself could betray him to entities that hungered for escaped mortals. Freedom was possible, but never guaranteed. One night, after weeks of relentless travel, Lorik found temporary refuge on a fringe world abandoned by Imperial cartographers. The planet was barren, winds tearing across jagged plains, and skies streaked with radiation storms. Here, for the first time, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, crouched beneath the skeletal remains of a long-dead outpost. He rationed what meager supplies he had scavenged, taking care not to make a fire, not to leave traces of habitation. The isolation was terrifying, but necessary. Even a single spark of visibility could summon the Imperium's retribution. Lorik knew that in this moment, he was alone, utterly unprotected, yet for the first time in months, he felt a measure of control over his existence. Survival, he realized, was no longer simply an act. It was a mindset, a discipline, and a constant negotiation with fear. Even in solitude, Lorik could not escape the Imperium entirely. Strange anomalies in the warp hinted at psychic probes searching for him. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and distant figures, possibly agents or cultists, appeared and disappeared without explanation. Every sound, every ripple in the terrain demanded vigilance. Sleep was broken into short fragments. Each waking was a test of endurance and nerve. He learned to move with silence, to observe without being observed, and to trust no one. The universe beyond the colony offered no sanctuary, only a constant test of survival and mental fortitude. And yet, the knowledge that he had escaped, that the Imperium's immediate grasp no longer chained him, was a seed of defiance that could not be extinguished. Each day he endured, he defied the Empire in its most terrifying form, the control over life and death. Lorik's existence became a series of calculated risks, punctuated by fleeting moments of reflection and bitter satisfaction. He scavenged supplies from wrecked spacecraft, traversed hazardous terrain, and avoided signs of warp corruption that could ensnare an unwary mind. He marked his path in subtle ways, leaving traces only he could read, to ensure he could navigate back to safety if needed. Time became a distorted measure, stretching in endless monotony, broken only by near-death encounters or the presence of strange entities observing him from the shadows. Even as months passed, he remained vigilant, understanding that the Imperium's reach could extend far beyond logic, through agents, psychic traces, or the warp itself. Survival was now a delicate balance of courage, calculation, and relentless discipline. And yet, even after all he had endured, Lorik understood a terrifying truth. Escaping the Imperium was not liberation, but a lifelong struggle. He had survived the colony, the Arbites, the servitors, and the psychic scourge of the Inquisition, yet he carried the weight of every soul captured, every scream he had heard, every comrade left behind. Freedom was a fragile ember in a universe designed to snuff it out. He could never return to the innocence of thought, the simplicity of belonging, or the safety of camaraderie. The Imperium's shadow would always follow, invisible but palpable, reminding him that the price of defiance was eternal vigilance, and the cost of freedom was never truly paid. Lorik had escaped, but in escaping, he became a ghost of himself, a survivor in a galaxy that demanded obedience and punished audacity with horrors beyond imagination. Even as Lorik traversed the alien fringes, the final truth settled over him like a suffocating fog. The Imperium was not merely a government or a collection of armies. It was a living, omnipotent force, eternal and unyielding. Freedom existed only in fragments, fleeting and temporary, and the cost of defiance extended far beyond what any mind could endure. Every choice, every breath, every heartbeat carried with it the weight of consequences that could echo across years, decades, or even centuries. The horror of the Imperium was not in its weapons or soldiers, but in the certainty of its reach, its patience, and its ability to consume not just the body, but the spirit. No corner of the galaxy was truly safe, and every shadow carried the memory of the Empire's judgment. The isolation that had once offered Lorik a semblance of safety became a mirror for the enormity of what he had escaped. In the silence of alien plains, he could hear the echoes of the colony, the screams of captured comrades, the mechanical hum of servitors, the psychic lances of inquisitors probing minds. These sounds, though distant, haunted him relentlessly, intertwining with his own memories, creating a tapestry of terror that could not be unraveled. Sleep became a treacherous ally, offering nightmares so vivid that waking brought little relief. Every movement in the wastelands became cautious, every rustle of wind a potential threat, every flicker in the horizon a reminder that the Imperium's vengeance was patient, persistent, and eternal. Even the few surviving companions he had left behind could not offer solace. He knew, with cold certainty, that they would either be captured or broken, one by the relentless machinery of the Imperium. He imagined the horrors they would endure, bodies twisted into servitors, minds wiped clean, souls flayed and forgotten. The knowledge was a constant weight in his chest, a reminder that even survival carried no triumph, only the lingering horror of what the Empire demanded. No victory could be claimed, no sense of accomplishment could persist. The Imperium had already exacted its toll, and every act of rebellion, every breath of defiance, had been accounted for in suffering and loss. As Lorik pressed further into the uncharted regions, he began to see the subtle ways in which the Imperium's influence extended into the void. Fringe worlds were haunted by the scars of conquest, ghost settlements abandoned after sudden purges, and warp anomalies twisted in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than chaos. He realized that even here, far from the immediate grasp of the colony, the Empire's presence lingered in subtle, insidious ways. The Imperium's punishment was not only physical or psychic, it was environmental, a manipulation of space itself to ensure that escape remained never more than a fleeting illusion. Every step into the void was a dance with invisible threads of control, and Lorik moved with a mixture of defiance and reverent fear. The realization weighed heavier with each passing day. Survival itself was a kind of damnation. To exist outside the colony was to carry the trauma, the guilt, and the memories of those who had fallen, been broken, or transformed. Lorik's mind replayed events endlessly, the wails of prisoners, the cold detachment of servitors, the psychic lacerations inflicted upon the captured. He had escaped their immediate grasp, but the echoes of punishment followed relentlessly, a chorus of suffering that refused to fade. Every decision he made was haunted by the knowledge that the Imperium's reach could strike at any time, and that the freedom he clung to was as fragile as a flame in a storm. Time became meaningless in this state of constant vigilance. Days and nights blurred together, the alien stars and radiation storms a backdrop to unending tension. Lorik's body adapted to hunger, exhaustion, and environmental hazards, but his mind remained stretched to the limits of endurance. Each moment was punctuated by awareness of danger, memory of loss, and anticipation of the Imperium's inevitable claim. The galaxy itself seemed complicit, indifferent to survival or defiance, offering only opportunities to endure or perish. He began to understand that the very act of thinking about freedom was a form of rebellion, and that thought alone could draw the Empire's attention through psychic means or the tendrils of its vast bureaucracy. Even solitude was not truly safe. Lorik discovered that the universe outside the Imperium's immediate reach was populated by entities, phenomena, and forces that could exploit weakness, madness, or desperation. Warp distortions whispered promises, shadowed shapes observed his movements, and the faint hum of long-dead machines suggested an intelligence that tracked persistence. Freedom was a landscape of terror where the absence of direct persecution did not equate to safety. Every encounter, every observation, every small interaction with the environment required vigilance and calculation. Survival demanded not only skill and resilience, but constant mental fortitude, a preservation of identity against the ceaseless encroachment of external forces and the echoes of the Imperium's influence. And yet, after months, Lorik came to the most harrowing truth. Even escape was insufficient to undo the Imperium's dominion. It was not a single force, but a pervasive, relentless system that existed across space, time, and thought. It claimed what it could not kill, reshaping lives, bending environments, and corrupting minds to serve its ultimate purpose. The cost of survival was eternal vigilance, and the cost of freedom was the burden of memory, trauma, and perpetual fear. As the last echoes of the Imperium's wrath faded into memory, Lorik stood alone on a barren cliff, staring at alien skies streaked with unfamiliar stars. He had survived the colony, the Arbites, the servitors, and the psychic scourges of the Inquisition. Yet the weight of all he had witnessed pressed down with relentless force. The screams of captured comrades, the mechanical cries of mind-wiped prisoners, the psychic lacerations inflicted upon the disobedient. These sounds were etched into his mind, replaying endlessly. Freedom was real, yet it was fragile, temporary, and forever shadowed by the certainty that the Imperium's reach was patient and absolute. Every breath he took was a defiance, but every moment reminded him that escape was merely a prelude to constant vigilance, not salvation. The emptiness of the world around him mirrored the hollow spaces left inside his soul. Friends had been lost, memories corrupted, bodies transformed beyond recognition. Even those who had survived alongside him were gone, either captured or scattered to the winds of the galaxy. Lorik felt the weight of survivor's guilt pressing on his chest, a suffocating reminder that freedom was bought with unbearable cost. Nights were restless, haunted by visions of horrors endured, while days demanded unyielding caution. Every movement required awareness of shadows, of warp distortions, of agents that might still hunt him. The Imperium's punishment extended far beyond the physical. It invaded thought, memory, and spirit, leaving scars invisible to the eye, but indelibly marked in the psyche of those who dared defy it. Even in solitude, hope persisted, fragile and flickering like a candle in a gale. Lorik understood that his survival was not merely chance. It was the result of every calculation, every careful movement, and every act of defiance against the seemingly infinite machinery of oppression. Yet that hope was tempered by terror, a constant reminder that the Imperium never forgives, never forgets, and never rests. He had escaped the immediate grasp of the colony, But the memory of its horrors followed, echoing in dreams and shadowed corners of consciousness. Every sound in the night, every ripple in the terrain, every distortion in the warp reminded him that freedom was not safety, only a continuation of the struggle, a journey through a galaxy where the cost of defiance could never be fully paid. Loric's mind wandered to the question that haunted all who dared flee. What is freedom in a galaxy ruled by such merciless power? Survival alone was no longer sufficient. It was a reminder of all he had lost. Every step forward was taken with the knowledge that the Imperium's shadow extended further than he could see, reaching through time, thought, and space. Yet despite the terror, the loss, and the constant awareness of danger, he pressed onward. To stop would mean surrender, a return to chains, to mutilation, to psychic torment. Life beyond the Imperium's walls was not liberation. It was an unending test of endurance, an eternal gamble with death, and a relentless confrontation with the echoes of horrors that had already claimed so much. And yet, in the desolate beauty of alien horizons, there remained a spark of defiance, a fragile ember that refused to die, no matter how far the shadows stretched.